So today, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about a little overview of the steps required to establish a supplementation program. Just to tell you to begin with, there's the department published a recovery strategy for Coho salmon about 9 years ago, 10 years ago. And in the back of that document, there's a couple of appendices that talk about how to use how we lay out our policy for how we can use hatcheries to help to restore coho salmon. And one of them, Appendix H, specifically refers to conservation programs, and it's a pretty long thing. We had I chaired a committee of pretty knowledgeable people who put that together along with myself, and it's a pretty good primer on the kinds of things that you need to consider and the specific conditions under which conservation, or as we called it in that document, a recovery hatchery, might be a useful thing for you. Now, so I'm not going to go through that stuff specifically today, but you can either go to the Department of Fish and Game's Fisheries Branch website and you can get that document there. It's the recovery strategy for California coho salmon. I think that's the name of it. And also, I made some slides at the end of this presentation from that document that give you kind of a flavor of what's in the document, some tables and diagrams, flowcharts, and a flowchart and some tables. And those are at the end of this document after the end slide. So when you look at this document on the web, you can get a flavor for what that's like. Okay. So when faced with low abundance, agencies have typically, since, well, for over 100 years, have traditionally taken action by raising fish in fish hatcheries. And we know that hatcheries can increase the early juvenile survival above that we see in streams, especially if those streams are not being productive for one reason or another. And we hope that this translates into increased spawner abundance 3 years later. But we also know that some of the features that make hatcheries effective at avoiding this early life history mortality can have negative effects. And these include genetic effects, which we talked a lot about yesterday, and other effects that we didn't talk about so much, but are still important, genetic and behavioral effects. And these are well documented, and you find them many, many places in the literature, including the status reviews and recovery plans that the state and federal agencies have produced, and we'd like to avoid them if possible. So there's considerable uncertainty about whether hatcheries can actually aid in recovery or the degree to which they can aid in recovery. The evidence for hatchery supplementation is somewhat mixed, and captive and conservation programs haven't shown conclusively that they can really restore populations or rehabilitate runs to viable levels over a long period of time. We do have some evidence that over the short term they can do that, and we do have some evidence that over the short term you can retain some relatively high level of genetic diversity, although not all. Pardon me. So, but the upshot of this is that for a number of reasons, the department still considers hatchery programs for recovery to be unproven, although we've had a lot of promising results recently. So a conservation or what the department sometimes calls a recovery hatchery, because they simply didn't like the nomenclature associated with conservation hatcheries as it has been developed, so some people decided to call them recovery hatcheries. So you'll see that in Department of Fish and Game literature. The purpose of them is to supplement depressed natural populations to provide fish for artificial recolonization. The idea is to maintain genetic diversity of all kinds and to conserve valuable or rare genes and genotypes. The kinds of techniques that can be employed might be the use of standard hatchery programs where adults return and then you spawn those fish and then you return those juveniles to the stream. Or it could include captive broodstock where you collect juveniles and then you raise them to adults in captivity, then you spawn them and put them out. Or maybe you raise fish in captivity to adulthood and then you put the adults out. There's all kinds of methodologies there are a number of methodologies associated with these conservation or recovery hatcheries that can be contemplated. One of the features of these hatcheries is that they all implement intensive management techniques and extensive monitoring in order to avoid the negative hatchery impacts that are associated with hatcheries as much as possible. And that's not to say that you can avoid them all, because you certainly can't. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind is the fishing game policy focuses on the importance of natural stocks for recovery. Now, the way the department and the rest of the state actually acts is not necessarily in concert with that, because we have lots of hatchery programs. Okay? And in fact, many of our runs are highly influenced by hatchery fish, if not almost completely composed of them. But as a policy, the Fish and Game Commission policy says that we'll rely on natural origin fish for as the basis of that resource. So in trying to keep in line with these policies, when we developed the guidelines and recommendations for recovery hatcheries or conservation hatcheries, we came up with a number of ideas here. First of all, we envisioned at the time that you just couldn't put a hatchery on every stream. So you had to envision that there would be a small number of hatcheries that would be doing this kind of work in the state. Now, that was in, say, 2000 when we developed this or so, right? In the meantime, coho salmon have become so imperiled across the state that we've had to change it and say, well, given that we can't just go and find the worst ones because they're all kind of the worst, right? That's not exactly true. I mean, certainly some of them are better than others, but a lot of them are in very bad shape. So we had to design some way to deal with that. That was something that we didn't anticipate in that document that you'll read, Appendix H, in that recovery strategy. So recently we've been talking about the regional hatchery concept. That is not putting a hatchery on every stream, but designing a system of hatcheries that possibly could be used in a regional context. It's been done in other places, and it's probably the only way that we're going to be able to accomplish using recovery or conservation hatcheries in the current climate that we have. Production levels should need to be appropriate to recovery goals, and that suggests that you have to have very specific recovery goals, and you have to have very specific ways that you're going to approach those. These programs should have a short lifespan with frequent monitoring for success. You should avoid creating hatchery-based runs, and you should avoid disproportional reliance on hatcheries for recovery. These last two are difficult, and you can see that in many of the things that we were talking about yesterday, and in fact in some of the questions that were asked today, some of those things that you would propose to do don't get you away from hatchery-based runs. They push you towards them, or they push you towards a high level of unnatural activity in the stream. For example, moving fish around barriers, or pardon me, or rescuing fish. Rescuing fish is the kind of thing that is okay in the short term. You might have to do it at some time, but it's not something you can use as a long-term strategy. It just doesn't solve the problem. So pardon me, some of the policy recommendations for protecting natural stocks are just to simply protecting the existing runs of natural coho salmon and other species, to protect recovering runs that are earmarked for non-hatchery based recovery. And this is something that we haven't been able to develop very well, but in principle, there are places, there should be some places where we might envision that we could have a hatchery there and influence runs based with a hatchery, and other places where we would not want to do that. Now for coho currently, the number of places where we could rely on natural reproduction and expect in the short term to get some kind of recovery is not very great. We also talked about developing risk-benefit analyses to determine whether a hatchery would be useful, to base production and releases on carrying capacity, and to locate hatcheries in a place where you would maximize recovery potential but avoid artificially mixing different stocks of fish. And lastly on here is a bullet about permitting. Permitting for hatcheries is, of course, something that you have to go through depending on the kind of hatchery or the kind of program that you're doing. There's a long list of permitting that needs to be accomplished before you can do that. What we found is that once a decision is made to develop a hatchery program, that permitting can be still pretty onerous and can still be take a long time, but it moves along and it happens. Creating new facilities is an area that requires a lot of thought. We developed decision guidelines for when you might want to start a new facility. We talked about the need for operations, detailed operations and closeout plans to be developed before you put the hatchery in, to develop steering committees to help you to get the needed expertise and broadness of expertise that will allow you to actually accomplish the program. Coordinate effort with coordination of effort and integration with overall recovery planning. So any recovery hatchery that you would, or recovery or hatchery operation that you would envision would need to be coordinated with any existing recovery plans. We also talked about decision-making rules and the importance of research. In many cases, there are two things about research. One is that sometimes you have to do some research in order to get the thing off the ground in the first place. Maybe genetics research, maybe ecological research, maybe it probably is both. So you have to answer questions about the critical questions in order to get the program to actually function. The other thing about research is that these conservation programs, pardon me, are a very effective nexus for research activity. So once you get these things started, you'll have people come in from all over the place wanting to do research on your fish. Partly it's because if you have a program like this, you actually have fish in hand, and of course that's the first thing you need to do research on fish, right? And if you can get somebody else to do it for you, develop the fish handling and fish catching system, then it makes it a lot easier to do it. So they form a nexus for research that really then propels the project and is an important element of any of these projects. Sorry, I think this slide is a little duplicative of some things we've talked about before, but I'll go through it anyway. The first thing to determine, and we provide guidelines about this, is whether or not you want a hatchery. Now, with coho salmon right now, if you go through the flow chart that outlines whether you need a hatchery or not, or whether a hatchery might be a useful thing to you, almost every place would pass. It would say, yeah, you need a hatchery there. So in some ways that flow chart is out of date, But it is still instructive to give you some idea of the kinds of things that we take into account. One of the things that you will want to look at in terms of deciding whether you want a hatchery or not is, what is the history of hatchery influence in that place? Is there any hatchery influence there? And if there is, and the population is still declining, the question is, why is that? Why is it that whatever you did before didn't work? Now, I can give you some examples of how this plays out. What we're talking, and how it gets to what a conservation program really is about. In the past, the department sometimes would do things like simply try something. They'd pick up some fish from a hatchery and they move them to another place and see what would happen. Now, what happened most of the time is nothing. Those fish disappeared, you didn't see them again, and that was that. Okay, so, but there was no follow-up, there was no trying to determine why that happened, although the people who actually did it may in fact know why it happened. And if you talk to them, if they're not dead or retired and moved to Montana, then you can sometimes find out why the hatchery program didn't work. But the contrast between that kind of activity and the kind of activity that we're proposing here with conservation hatcheries is all about the amount of information that you're collecting and the process that you're going through to try to determine what might work, and then try to find out whether it did or not and why it did or not, and then keep moving. Okay? Tolerance for hatchery influence is an important element. Typically, you'll want to manage for a natural stock, but you're going to have a mixed natural origin, a hatchery origin stock, and I talked about that a little bit yesterday, and so did some other people. You also have to consider your tolerance for straying from the site where you're putting animals and from other places as well. When you're talking about whether you should have a hatchery or not, you should have some sense of the potential for natural recolonization and how long that might take to reestablish a population if you were to use that alone. Even if you aren't using that alone, even if you aren't saying, well, we're going to allow natural or encourage natural recolonization, if you do have natural recolonization, you're going to have to dovetail that with your hatchery program. And that's something that takes quite a bit of effort, actually, to do it properly. Okay? Also the timeline. Sometimes natural recolonization might be the thing you'd want to do, but it won't happen in your lifetime, so you're not all that interested in it. Okay. A hatchery option might not even be feasible in a lot of cases. You have to look at location and, critically, whether or not you have the water to run a hatchery. If water is a problem, then a hatchery's not going to be a hatchery on that site is not going to be is probably not going to be a very good solution. Staffing and expertise. Because these kinds of programs are kind of special. They require a lot of staffing and expertise. We have fish culture experts at all of our hatcheries that are very good at raising fish. But the kind of thing that needs to be done here requires a little bit of a change in the way that they do things. In every case where we've tried it, the fish culturists were able to come up to whatever, and do whatever was needed to be done. But the fish culturists are only one member or one part of a team of people that has to be involved in a conservation hatchery program. You need to have people from a wide array of disciplines. And you also need some people who can provide you with funding. Getting money is a big deal, like for everything, right? Also, you have to think about fitness costs versus increased abundance and how long it'll take to restore natural origin fitness, if ever. The context of the program is important. You have to think about the importance of that stock in the ESU and kind of step back and look at it, because in lots of cases, and this is an example of that, you're very concerned about your own home watershed, right? But in trying to determine what you're going to do there, you really have to step back and look at it in the context of the entire ESU, and maybe even in a bigger context than that, in order to determine what you want to do in that particular smaller scale space that you're really concerned about. You have to think about recovery potential, and that means habitat quality and quantity, because a hatchery program is good at producing fish, right? It's good at producing fish, but it does nothing for habitat rehabilitation. So if you can't, the upshot of this is you can't solve a habitat problem by putting more fish there. Okay? Now there are rationales for putting fish in a place while you're doing habitat rehabilitation, and those kinds of things are logical and can work. But putting fish there into a place is not a long-term strategy that can be done just in and of itself, okay, without anything else. You have to look at feasibility, and one of the things here is long-term commitment. These things can cost a lot of money, and they can cost a lot of manpower and expertise. So you have to get commitments from the entities that are involved for a long haul. You should look at existing programs in the area and see if you can possibly retask those or expand them to address some of your goals, because there's a problem in starting from zero. When you start a hatchery program, if you're envisioning a full-blown conservation program, it can cost a lot of money. Pardon me. The kinds of actions that are anticipated also is important. You got to think about what kind of program you want, of course, whether it's a full-blown conservation hatchery like Livingston Stone here at the base of Shasta Dam, or whether you want some other kind of program that maybe is something like, or some other kind of program that relies on an existing hatchery program or something else. The second thing I won't go into too much because we talked about it an awful lot yesterday, and that's, do you have enough fish to solve your fish problem? Okay. The do you have enough fish question relates to the kind of program that you might want to have, because with different levels of abundance or different characteristics of the population, you may choose one possibility over another. One of the big features of conservation programs, no matter what you do, is that they have intensive genetic stock management, and that's true almost across the board. And here we talk about the kinds of things that same things we talked about yesterday: avoiding inbreeding, maximizing effective size of hatchery and wild populations, and the combined hatchery and wild group, avoiding hatchery origin, natural origin divergence for integrated populations, and that's done by incorporating natural origin fish. And of course, like we said yesterday, that also has some application to avoiding domestication selection if you do it correctly. And protection of the natural origin component. And lastly, all conservation programs require a detailed hatchery and genetic management plan. It's something that seems like a big pain in the neck to do, but the value in my experience of the hatchery and genetic management plan is that it's very effective at shining a light on those things where you don't have a very good rationale, or shining a light on those things where you really need to improve or focus to get more information, or to do something differently than you have been doing before. Steering groups are important for troubleshooting and also for day-to-day management of these kinds of programs, as is adaptive management. So that's gathering information about what you're doing and then changing what you're doing based on the results that you get. And we've used that, we've used both steering groups and adaptive management pretty effectively in some of the programs, in all the programs that we currently run in the state. If you have this broad range of expertise in your steering groups, you can solve problems much more simply than if you have just one person with one kind of expertise, who, or a couple of people, or you simply rely on the culture professionals whose job is to raise fish, and they may not even feel comfortable with some of the things that they might be asked to comment on or to try to solve. And it's better to have a broad range of expertise in the hatchery. Monitoring is always associated with these things, sometimes very extensive, and it's important to have very clear goals for your monitoring, which you're trying to accomplish, and to then, basically this is to determine whether the project is working as you expected or not. Something that's sometimes overlooked in these things is the importance of determining when you've done what you tried to do. If you have a very detailed and precise purpose for your program, then you can, you'll have some sense of when you've attained that. And you really need very precise sorts of indicators for when the program is working. You have to envision beforehand what a successful program would look like. And what I'm saying here is that before you even start, I recommend that you have some idea of what success is like. And if there, and then the question is, are you really prepared for that? Are you really prepared to do the monitoring that's associated with a large population of fish and so forth? What if you succeed beyond your wildest dreams? What if you have thousands of fish coming back? It's easy to do monitoring, at a certain level, but at another level, you have to have it's harder. It's harder. And then you also have to look at whether there are downsides to the approach that you're taking or the implementation that you're thinking. And then when and how to close the program and how to change the program. For example, if you have a captive program and it seems to be working and then you start to get fish back, you may want to transition to a simpler program where you use those adult fish that are returning and just function as, in a more traditional sort of way. And that's all, and I'll take some questions if you'd like. Thanks.
Okay, so we don't get further behind. Let's keep the questions to just 5 minutes. Michael's going to be here all day, correct, Michael?
Yes.
And so Michael's presentation is, that's the overview, the 30,000-foot view, the checklist view. So my guess is any of the next 6 presenters could raise questions that Michael might also be able to weigh in on. But let's start with Jim here.
Yeah, there might be some examples later in terms of case studies for this question, but I'm very interested in evaluations of carrying capacity, and anything you can share, Michael, on how that's been evaluated.
We've not very often, actually. But in some programs, there's an attempt to establish habitat, amount of habitat, and then to apportion fish to streams on the basis of that in order to establish a certain target density. So Ben might talk about that a little bit later. In the Coho program, we do that.
What life history stage is the focus? Is it in spawning? Is it rearing?
Well, it's initially typically, in this case, the case I'm talking about, it's juvenile carrying capacity. But you're right that although we talk about it and we would like to do it more, it's not very easy. And honestly, in the beginning, establishing carrying capacity over all life stages is not really the thing that you're going to be focusing on. You're going to be focusing on producing some fish. And then when you start to see fish come back, you'll get some sense of maybe what you need. So that's kind of the way we've approached it. And unfortunately, it's not a very intellectually satisfying sort of sort of approach, but it's the practical approach that we've taken in most cases. So.
All right, is there
Any more?
anybody else who's got a heart-pounding question? All right, then let's thank Michael again.
Thank you.